Good morning, everyone. Can you
Good
hear me?
morning. Yep. Good morning.
Maybe I'll just give another minute to see if everybody's here, and then we'll get started. It looks like there's a good number of you, so I'm not sure that it's productive to have everyone introduce themselves first and share what department or program they're in. So perhaps at the end, when we do questions or Q&A, we can share that information. Does that seem reasonable?
Sure.
All right. So I have some PowerPoint slides, which I will share in just a moment. And I want to say right off the bat that one of the issues with talking about disability and practicing designing a program that accommodates every kind of disability is that you can't always accommodate every person at every moment in every situation. So my slides are text heavy and I will be talking, but I know that we are recording, and I designed my slides so that you would be able to have that information later. But if you have any questions about anything, or if you'd like to talk about your courses or anything else at another time, I would be more than happy to meet with you face-to-face or in a Zoom or any other format. So with that, I'll get started, and I will share my screen here. Hang on one second, my slides didn't pop up. Okay, here we go. All right. So I'll start just by introducing myself. I'm Jen Celio. I'm in the Department of English, and I also am the director of the writing program, which is also housed in English. And the reason I'm presenting today on increasing accessibility for students with so-called invisible disabilities is that I recently taught a graduate course, and we focused on rhetoric and disability. And so a lot of the impetus for this topic comes from that course. One of the books that we read in that course was Margaret Price's book, Mad at School. And Price is a professor of English at Ohio State, and she self-identifies as mentally ill. And her title plays with the idea of madness, inviting us to consider ways that mental illness and mental disability are viewed within higher education. So we have madness as a typical way, a degrading way of talking about mental illness, but also some of the anger and violence and disruption that we see in our students. So we tend to associate disability with anger and madness and violence. And also the other play on that is that students are often frustrated and angry about the way that they are viewed and treated as students with mental disabilities, and that's Price's term. And I would also say that this holds true for faculty and staff. So it plays on that idea about being angry with the frustration and the obstacles to learning that are often in place. And so, as you can imagine, in an institution like higher education, where things like reason and having a sound mind and being rational or collegial are at a premium, mental illnesses are often concealed, or when they're discovered, they're stigmatized. So my class and I read this text at the end of the semester, and by that time we were pretty comfortable with each other. So many students felt safe disclosing their own struggles with mental disabilities, which is Price's umbrella term for everything from dyslexia to depression to ADHD to bipolar disorder. So she uses that umbrella term frequently. And we discussed the challenges that they face, the students in my class, but also that their own students face. So there were some teachers in the class. And we talked a lot about how many of these obstacles could be avoided or eliminated outright. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. Our collective move online, often to Canvas or to Zoom, gives us some options that we might not have otherwise had or become familiar with. So part of this talk is sort of using the knowledge that we gained during the pandemic to make our courses more accessible. Okay, so our goals for this session. I've listed them here and they're pretty simple. Define and identify some invisible disabilities and think about the ways that our current classroom practices might create unintentional obstacles, and then consider some ways of designing more accessible pedagogies and practices. But I think we could also just simplify it further to say that the main goal is to raise awareness and, when possible, to consider changes that can make our courses more accessible. And I say when possible very deliberately, and that last goal down there at the bottom is critical. We need to remind ourselves at every step that we can't do it all right away or ever. And we can't expect to have all of these things under control by the end of this talk or by the end of next semester. Making our classes more accessible isn't a task to complete or something to tick off a list. It's a way of thinking and a way of doing. And it has to evolve as our students evolve, as our classrooms evolve, as our technologies evolve. So we can only do our best at any given moment and just continue to try. So one more quick note before I jump in. A lot of literature uses the terminology invisible disabilities. And so that's a way that you would find more information about that. And to the extent that many of our students and our colleagues and ourselves and our friends try to hide disabilities or make them unseeable, these are invisible disabilities. But many in the disability studies world take issue with the term invisible because it suggests that these disabilities don't truly exist, or that they're all in the imagination of the individual. And so I want to honor that distinction, but also give you the term that you can probably find the most information. So I think non-visible is a better term, but not everybody's caught up with that yet. So with that, so what do we mean by so-called invisible disabilities? I think if we start with a broad definition of disability, and we define it as a condition that limits, challenges, or prohibits an individual's movements, senses, or activities, especially in an environment like higher ed that requires students and faculty and staff to follow a set of rigid and normative rules for success, we can see that many of the conditions that are present on this slide are things that would possibly limit, challenge, or prohibit our students from succeeding in our classrooms. But I also want to point out that when we think about the disability as the condition, as something inherent in the individual, that's one way. So we say she's disabled because she uses a wheelchair, or he's disabled because he has dyslexia. That's a common way of understanding disability. But I would argue, and I think this is an important point, that another way of understanding disability is to understand that the conditions are what is disabling. So the environment is disabling rather than the individual who purportedly has the disability. If a building had ramps instead of steps, the wheelchair user wouldn't be limited or disabled because they could use the ramp. And indeed, everyone can use a ramp. So often we need to remember that the environment is the disabling condition, not the individual with a so-called disability. So I don't want to go through this list. It's not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but I've tried to create some categories and examples of disabilities or ways of doing or thinking that might limit our students and ourselves and our colleagues and our friends from being able to learn and succeed in higher education. And again, at the bottom here, I think it's important to recognize that some of the challenges are temporary. So even a change in medication or sleep deprivation or a car accident or a death in the family can be a temporary challenge that might create depression or anxiety or something like that. So all of these, everything on this list and more can create disabling conditions for our students. As you peruse this list, you might question some of these conditions as disabilities. You might find yourself identifying with one or another, and you might wonder why a student wouldn't request an accommodation if they felt that they needed one based on one of these things, or if they felt limited. And you might be making comparisons, trying to determine if one condition has more merit than another one. And so I would only ask you to keep in mind during this talk that many of these conditions come with stigma or shame or both and more. And especially in higher education, where we're a little top heavy with our brains, right? So cognitive disabilities in particular can be very, they can have a lot of stigma attached to them. And so you can understand why students and us are reluctant to disclose or identify with some of these conditions. So students and us, all of us, often try to pass. And so while we might wish for a world without that stigma, until then, and even after, we have to understand that it's always going to be risky and sometimes dangerous for people to disclose a particular disability. There's a lot of research about tenure and getting tenure with a disability. And so it's not just our students who face these struggles. Okay, I see that there are some chat questions coming up, or there are just some comments in the chat. I'll wait until the end to address them unless Vanessa or Tracy stops me and says, I need to address something. Okay.
Yeah, I don't mind waiting until the end. We can answer them all after you're done.
Okay, great. All right. So I need you to sort of take a deep breath right now. This is the hardest slide. It's difficult because, and I'm only highlighting a couple of practices here, but this slide highlights classroom practices and pedagogies, and in particular, unstated assumptions about ability that we hold dear and that many of us view as inherent to teaching and learning in college. When we look at this list, presence, participation, productivity, independence, we sort of see these as the hallmark of what somebody should be able to do when they come to college. And so we might rightly feel anger. How am I supposed to hold students accountable if I don't take attendance? I've asked this question myself. Shame. Oh my gosh, I've been unintentionally hurting my students. Frustration. If I don't call on students or give pop quizzes, they won't read. Or we might feel indignant. If a student can't behave appropriately in a classroom, then they shouldn't be in college. And it's okay to have these feelings, it is. We've had years of thinking one way and it's hard to change quickly. But I think when we start to look at some of these assumptions that we hold about how we should be in school, we can see that some of these things might be a little bit, it might create a disabling environment for our students. So when we think about things like mandatory attendance, or being attentive and engaged in class at all times, or always being on camera when we have a Zoom class, demanding that students participate in in-class discussions, or do real-time group work, or do on-time, like in-class writing or on-demand writing. or in-class quizzes or exams. When we have rigid deadlines that don't leave room for different kinds of productivity or different paces of productivity, I guess I would say. And then independence, which I think is especially difficult, completing work without support or assistance, or knowing what to do without clear instructions, understanding tacitly the rules of higher ed, right? So I think we probably all adhere to one or more of these. I know I do. And if we think about going back to that idea of the ways that some invisible disabilities might limit, challenge, or prohibit our students, we can see that some of these practices might be potentially disabling. I have a long quote next, and I apologize for including a long quote, but I think this example is very useful, so I offer it in full. This is a quote from Margaret Price, and she's talking about a familiar teaching practice. And so she says to start that we are accustomed to thinking of classroom accommodations in terms of measurable steps that can help level the playing field. Note takers, extra time on exams, captions on videos, lecture slides posted online, Braille and large print handouts, the presence of a sign interpreter. All of these things are classroom accommodations, right? That we would have, maybe a little, some challenge ourselves instituting them or getting accustomed to them, but we would do them. But what accommodations do we offer the student who is earnestly participating, but in ways that do not fall into the usually rationalist pattern of classroom discussions and activities? Although the notion of a classroom discussion implies that it is open to all perspectives, this setting is in fact controlled by rigid expectations. Students taking part in a discussion are expected to demonstrate their knowledge of the topic at hand, raise relevant questions, and establish themselves as significant but not overly dominant voices in a crowd of at least 15 and usually many more other persons. And I would point out that that doesn't even include our own individual as teachers demands on class discussions, raising hands, letting somebody, like making everybody speak once before you speak twice. Particular rules about which topics are appropriate or not appropriate. So you can imagine that a student who has a cognitive disability or a mental disability might struggle with some of these rules, especially if they didn't know them or they weren't used to, they weren't able to recognize social cues quite as well. So I would, just to take you back to that other slide briefly, some other complications, even in this list here, is that depending on the teacher, we all have different rules and different setups for our classrooms. So students can't even count on consistent expectations. One teacher might want straight paraphrasing of a reading as part of a discussion. Another one might want provocative questions. Somebody else might use a Socratic method. Somebody might only want the discussion to make connections between the material in the textbook and current events. So those are all different sets of types of discussions. But then we also have things like the fact that these expectations aren't being communicated directly at the beginning of class or anytime. And then if we compound this, we can see that class discussions are just one thing, right? We have reading aloud, we have peer response activities, we have group work, we have oral presentations, we have office hours, and all of these activities that we tend to think of as normal, everyday college type activities. We know what they're for and we understand them, but we sometimes don't do a great job of communicating them with our communicating them to our students. So what does mandatory attendance look like to a student with Crohn's disease or a student who has a very acute episode of depression that makes getting out of bed impossible on a given day? What does participation look like to a student with anxiety or to a student who identifies as autistic, who might not understand social cues in the same way? What does productivity mean to a student who has suffered a trauma, a car accident, anything, or abuse, or who may be living with chronic pain or fatigue? So when we hold these ideals in our heads and assumptions, we may be unintentionally making it difficult for our students to succeed. All right, so moving ahead, there are things that we can do to alleviate and eliminate obstacles for all of our students. And these are some of the suggestions that Price offers in her book. I've tried to condense some of them and I haven't addressed them all. I have information about her book at the end. So one thing we can do is just to remember the presence of non-visible disabilities and students with non-visible disabilities in our classrooms and our colleagues. I mean, this goes for meetings and workshops as well. Assume that you will have students with non-visible disabilities who do not disclose their conditions. I think that's a safe assumption. Also think about feasibility. Think about your own teaching style, the course, the content. What can work now? What small changes can you make now or in a particular course? What might be possible with more time or in a different class? Keeping in mind that one thing may not be feasible in one situation, but another thing might. Perhaps most importantly is communicate clearly and be explicit. Revise your course policies or just revisit them and make sure that your disability statement is clear. Maybe it's just the boilerplate from the university and you could expand on that or make it more explicit. What needs more detail? What could you spell out more clearly for all of your students, but especially students who might need to know a little bit more about how things work? Attendance, participation, conversation. Is there a way to change your attendance policy so that students can miss a few days or can connect with you via office hours instead of attending a given class? So those are 3 things. There's 2 more. Provide alternatives. Consider incorporating non-physical classroom spaces and technologies, or alternative assignments, or alternative deadlines, in addition to or in place of some traditional classroom pedagogies or practices. So we'll talk about this more in just a minute. And this is where I think we can sort of engage together in discussion to share ideas. I'm just trying to give information at this point. But I think we have access to many more alternatives as a result of the pandemic. So we can talk about those. And the last thing I think is to experiment with multiple feedback channels. Part of the reason those disabilities are not visible to us is that students don't disclose them, but we might gather more information if we create more feedback channels. Invite students to annotate your syllabus online. So put a version of your syllabus in Google Docs and invite students to ask questions, answer questions for each other, show you places where they have questions or where they don't understand. Ask them how their learning processes work. A quick free write at the beginning of class, just getting students to share a little bit about how they learn and understand would give you more information and might help all of us, think about different ways to accommodate our students, regardless of whether or not they disclose. Be observant, watch your students work. Consider anonymous Qualtrics surveys to ask questions about if something is working or not, if students need an alternative, how close, like how are they feeling about the deadline? What challenges are they facing? Invite students to work in groups, in class, or virtually to identify shared concerns. So sometimes it's easier for students to voice concerns together in a group and not have to sort of own that concern, right? So a student with anxiety about a deadline might be more willing to share that with a smaller group of students who can then say, hey, we're all sort of worried about this, rather than expecting the student who has an anxiety disorder to share that information with you face to face. Okay, last slide before we have some conversation. I think this is the best part. We have a lot of these technologies right at our fingertips as a result of most of us going to Canvas last semester. So even if we don't do all of these things or any of these things right away, we still have some access to them. So small things like alternating between in-class discussions and using Canvas discussion boards, or holding a class meeting on Zoom, or using the chat function in Zoom, or just having students open up a chat. We have the technology to do that now, and many students find that writing is a better way for them to collect their thoughts and put the thoughts out without having to speak. So just alternating or offering one class discussion in an alternative format might give those students an opportunity to learn and show you their learning in a way that a face-to-face class discussion, traditional style, might not. Consider giving students the choice to work face-to-face or in Google Docs to gather feedback from each other or from you in those formats rather than in-person peer response. Invite students to complete processes of any sort in order of comfort or their own internal coherence, rather than first you free write, then you brainstorm, then you draft the paper, then you do peer response. I mean, that's just the writing process. That's what I'm comfortable with. But there are lots of things that we could say to students, you do this in the order that's comfortable for you. Come to me when you're ready with your draft of the product, whatever it is. Consider a more permissive attendance policy and offer students the choice or the opportunity to view videos. I know many of us have lectures from our time in online that we could post and invite students who can't attend class on a given day to view the lecture instead. Post videos for students who may need to miss class, or reconsider the insistence that students have cameras on or that they attend a given class and not get notes from a peer. And then finally, try in-person, Zoom, and chat-based office hours instead of having your students always come to your physical office space, which can be intimidating and difficult for students for a number of reasons, invisible disabilities or not. So I think I would really love to hear more ideas. I'm sure you have them and questions, but I think that these are just a few things that we have access to. And so just to sort of close before I bring us all back together, I think the most important thing is to remember that designing more accessible spaces for our students to learn, regardless of their disability, is a process. So if we start to think about universal design or designing universally accessible classes, if we think about that as an action, as a way to move, as a worldview, we can stop thinking about trying to tailor our environment to particular groups of people or one student or another, and start thinking about it as a mindset. And in doing so, recognize that it's really just a form of hope, and it's a manner of trying and making an effort. And then the last thing, I love this quote, the best I can offer is not perfection, nor even frequent success, but consistent effort. And so I think that I think helps us understand that we can't do it all at one time, but if we take small steps or just try, that sometimes makes all of the difference for a student or a colleague or a family member who might be limited by an environment. Okay, my last slide, just to show you, has 4 sources here on, in particular, disability in higher ed and invisible disabilities or non-visible disabilities, and especially sort of cognitive um, and what Price would call mental disabilities. So some of it is about the obstacles that we face as faculty and staff, but a lot of it has to do with our students as well. Okay, so that was a lot. But I'm happy to take questions or to start the conversation. I see that there's a lot of questions. Tracy, do you want to moderate?
Yeah, I absolutely will. And I just want to say really sincerely thank you for that. That was really, really wonderful. And I know that I will be thinking a lot about what you said and bringing that into what I do. So that was wonderful.
Thanks.
Starting at the top here, I know some of these some people have had some conversation, but I think we would all really love to hear what you have to say as well. How do we handle students that continually tell us about sleep issues, medication adjustments, et cetera, that inhibits their ability to turn assignments in on time? And if this is with almost every due date, what do you suggest?
I think that, so the first thing I would say is if the student is comfortable telling you about the sleep issues, then they might be comfortable talking to somebody in the Office of Accessibility. So the first step, if a student came to me and said, I'm really struggling with sleep, et cetera, I might say, well, if this is a chronic situation or something that's persistent, it might be worthwhile to talk to the Office of Accessibility, because they might not just need an accommodation in your class. They might need an accommodation in all of their classes, right? They could be struggling with something that's bigger than just a simple, I can't make the deadline. But then I might invite the student to tell me, well, how would you like to solve this problem? Or what would you like to have happen here? Because my guess is that they don't not want to turn the material in. They want to learn, but they may just have anxiety about deadlines. Or if they're struggling with sleep, they may have better times and not so great times. And so I might consider me personally, I might consider inviting that student to give me a set of deadlines, or to say, I'll have the first half of the class work submitted by this period, like by midterm, and then give them until the end to submit the rest. That means a different kind of grading for me and more work, but I might be willing to do that if I knew that it would support that student. I don't know, other ideas, other people want to chime in. I mean, I think sometimes it's a case-by-case basis, but sometimes it's just a matter of thinking about, why do I have this deadline? Is it absolutely necessary that students complete this assignment before they complete this assignment? Or have I just created that deadline because I'm accustomed to creating deadlines? And so,
Can I?
yeah, go right ahead. Yes,
Yeah,
please.
this is Ryan A. I just wanted to say you were so amazing, and I'm just so glad to be a part of this discussion. I had a student, and she's dealing with a lot. She's a single mom, and so I extended some deadlines for her, and then she had a car wreck, and just a lot of things happening. And so, me personally, I kind of took a similar approach to you, and I said, okay, what would you like to see happen here? And it definitely gave her, I think it put the ball back in her court, and it took the stress off. And so because it allowed her to know that for me, the goal is for you to be successful. And so if that is our goal, and I think it's hers too, we can come to a shared pool of meaning. And then the how becomes less important in terms of this having to be this way, but the goal is to get you to a place of where you learn the material, you understand it, and I can grade it. And I know some of my other colleagues who are professors, they are a little bit more stringent or rigid than me. And they're like, oh no, 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 no. So it just feels good to be in a space where you're around like minds that are saying, we want to see the students succeed. And we realize everybody's dealing with different things. So you have to be adaptable. I know that isn't the same level for everyone, but I just wanted to say, I think what you said is amazing. So
Thank you. And I just noticed in the chat that Rebecca is Rebecca Elkins. No, I don't see everybody on my screen.
Yes.
Yeah, that some of the assignments do build on each other, right? And so in that case, maybe changing a deadline for that student isn't going to be possible, but there would be other ways of supporting that student and all your students on their way to those deadlines. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's back to feasibility, right? Can you do it? Does it work in this class? If not, there might be other things that you can do that would support the student if a floating deadline doesn't. Other comments or questions? I should have just not said anything there. Hi, Rachel, I can actually see you, so I can see your hand.
I have a question, and it sort of connects to what we've been talking about. My policy has always been like, I'll have the deadline and then I just leave it up so they can always post things late. My question has to do with just building block type assignments. And I know for some of us, those have to be really stringent, right? Really strict. And for some of us, we have some more playroom as far as the order, which you had mentioned, as far as students being able to go through, say, building blocks or scaffolding in the order that makes sense to them cognitively. And I'm wondering if you could say more about what that would look like, or experiences you've had with that, Jen, where, like, I'll emphasize, just as an example, students being able to move lens in, lens out. Now, I always start lens out personally and then go close, but I know some students begin with the details and then have to grow out to context, right? And that's just an example
Yes.
of a natural thought pattern. And I noticed that, like, in my quizzes, I always start with questions that are far out and then end with questions that are close in. Whereas for some students, it's just more natural to start the other way.
Yeah.
And so I'll do both now, like back and forth. But as far as like scaffolding for assignments, just insight into that from you or anybody else.
I was just gonna say,
kind of let students do building blocks in their own order or something.
yes. But I almost don't want to say anything. I almost want to ask what other people have done in that situation, or what can we imagine
So
as
this is,
a
I'm
possibility?
sorry, Jen, this is Maureen. We have a faculty member, Seth Adije, who does research on middle school math and making that work up that you usually think is scaffolding. And he actually has seen an improvement in learning and more work done when the students are able to choose the order they want to do it in. So I've removed all scaffolding from my lab assignments and it's worked out fine.
That's great. That's awesome. That's a great example. And I was thinking about labs as I was preparing this, because it's been a long time since I've been in a lab. And I just remember being in chemistry lab, and things have to be done in a certain order or you don't get precipitant, and then you don't get precipitant and then you fail the lab, right? Or maybe that was just my situation. But there are some things that you have to do in order. But in your example, working through a problem, it might be easier to start in the middle and then work your way back and then forward, or just take the scaffolding away altogether. Rachel, I'm thinking about the writing process, and we all have had the student who writes the paper and then goes back and writes the outline. And we insist on an outline, but they do it at the end, because that's just not how their brains work. So that's one way, but I was also thinking about the ways that we demand information from students and what counts as coherence. And I think I'm guilty of this when I'm reading student writing, because I want it to be presented in an order so that it's easy for me to grade, so that I can see that they have everything. But what is the problem of flipping it over? What is the challenge of a student who sort of writes in a circular way and finally ends up at the point at the end, rather than the sort of top-down thesis? Why am I so insistent on one form of coherence, when for a student it might be more of a quilted pattern or a swirl, right? And so I don't know that I could do that all the time, but what would it mean to not demand a particular form, or to be more more permissive isn't the right word, more accommodating to students who write in different ways or process ideas in different ways? Other ideas or suggestions or things that you can imagine? Other people? I don't have all the answers. I should have said that from the start. I guess it's probably pretty clear.
I have a question. I think all these ideas are wonderful, particularly because they incorporate what we've learned in the last two and a bit semesters to how to best help accommodate all of us who have had to be challenged by the pandemic. At this point in time, when you raise this in this way, my question to you and to others is, how explicit should we make this in our syllabus? The reason why is because the students have assumed that they will get points off and for late submissions, and I haven't done that. I haven't done it for the last 2 semesters. I don't take any points off late, but many of them ask and some of them don't. So if they ask, I say, no, I won't take points off for lateness. I never do. But I haven't made that explicit as a policy throughout the class because, as you have mentioned, so many of us have different approaches to the work. I'm not sure. I mean, building blocks is an important part of the writing process to me, but I also understand what others have said about sometimes you start at the end and then find out what you want to say about it, having done that.
Yeah. So
So the question is, how explicit do you think we should be in the syllabus?
I think that's a personal choice. Um, my sense is that you should be as explicit as you want to be one semester and see what happens. Really. So I've told students, let's all turn our work in on time if we can, because we all have other things that we need to do and we don't want to let things linger if we can do them, right? There's a difference between just not attending to a task and not being able at a given moment or being limited, right? So I think many students want to submit their work when it's time or as close to it as possible because they don't want it lingering or they want to learn.
Right.
But then I always say, but if you can't submit it on time, let me know. Or just, there's not a huge, I don't penalize for late work. And I usually don't have a problem. They submit it. If they don't turn it in ever, that's a different challenge. But I just haven't really had a problem with that. But again, I can imagine that that might not be feasible for everyone, right? That's just simply not where they want to go. That if they don't want to, and this is reasonable. Like, I don't have time to grade work after I've collected it because I have other things I want to do too. And so I'm not going to accept late work, or there will be a penalty for late work. Okay, that may not be this year's or this semester's practice, right? but you can say that explicitly to students so that they know the consequences, right? I don't accept late work. Here's why. Here's what you need to do. Here are the resources on campus, whatever. That can be communicated and then move on, you know? But I think a lot of times we think to ourselves, well, students need to learn about deadlines because in the real world, there are deadlines. Well, yes, there are deadlines in the real world, but none of them are like the deadlines that we impose on them in school where they're doing work for 5 classes and they all have to do something, do it midterm or on this day or that day. Like that's not the real world. So I sometimes think we rely on deadlines as this construct that maybe we could be a little easier with. But again, that's me. That's just me. That's just me. You don't have to do what I do. And I won't do some of the things that you do, I'm sure. So we own our, I mean, like we don't own our classrooms, but we all have our classroom. We could do whatever we want in our classrooms because that's what we've done, right? And in our offices and our spaces, we have that. That's what we do. We don't have to accommodate everybody. Nobody's asking us to. It's not the law unless they request an accommodation. So you don't have to, but we could. We could.
I love this conversation, Jen, as you know. And I wanted to kind of return back to something because I think that Maureen put in the chat towards the beginning, because I think it's a really interesting tension that we come up against, which is, you know, the idea, how do we evaluate I guess the truthfulness, not even the truthfulness, but even like, we're not in a position, we are not psychiatrists, we're not, doctors, we're not anything like this. So how do we as instructors, evaluate and say, okay, this is how we're going to put the accommodations if we're not going through, the office of accessibility or things like that. I'd just love to kind of return to that conversation and get your opinion and everybody else's opinions on that, or experiences, because I think it was such an interesting thing that we hit up against.
I think in a perfect world, we would all feel comfortable asking for help when we needed help. For whatever reasons we needed help. I think different kinds of stigmas wouldn't be attached to different kinds of abilities and learning processes and ways of being and ways of doing. But I don't think it's that way. So I will say that just in the graduate class that I taught, one of the students had requested an accommodation. That accommodation wasn't always honored, not by me, but I know that that student had said, I've had people not accommodate me for this particular situation. And that was shocking, but I got it, but I did. And then as we talked about it, more and more students sort of disclosed the challenges that they face in the classroom. And I would have had no idea if we hadn't been talking about it as a topic, right? So just the number of students who didn't feel comfortable labeling themselves or identifying as something or asking for help or saying, like, I missed class because I had a bout of depression. That's hard to say out loud to anyone, including yourself. And so for us to expect our students to say, like, I didn't come to class because I had a bout of depression is a lot, I think. And that doesn't even get into HIPAA or anything else like that, right? It's like nobody should have to disclose a medical condition. But I think if we saw a student come into our classroom with crutches, we would have no question. We would immediately stand up, move the desks, make it easier for that person to move into the room, even if it was, not, they hadn't asked for an accommodation. We would just see that they needed help. But we don't always see that our students need this help. So I don't know. I don't feel like I did a good job of answering that question. What do other people think? I mean, I think we're never going to get to a point where people are just going to say like, hey, I didn't come to class because I was changing medications and I couldn't wake up, because it's embarrassing and shameful, and it's overdetermined with society's understanding of how we should be, what it means to be a good student or a good person or of sound mind, right? So I think it's especially complicated. But what do other people think? I'm going to stop talking.
I also would add to that too. I think that one of the issues that we run into, and I can say this as somebody who has been a student in classes, is that the accommodation requires a lot from the student in order to go through all of these hoops to get that and get the medical sign off from the doctor, things like that, which, you know, carries in and of itself several obstacles. You know, money, yes. And even being believed by doctors. And I mean, we've seen that there are racial disparities and gender disparities when it comes to being taken seriously, even from a medical standpoint. So adding that layer to it, I think, can be also very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, something like fibromyalgia. There are people who don't think that that's a thing, who don't believe people when they say I'm in chronic pain, or this is a condition that, you know, I mean, there are lots of things we don't know how it feels to, well, some of us might know how it feels to suffer from an anxiety disorder, or to be sort of obsessive compulsive, or to be dealing with a trauma or abuse or anything else like that. And just saying, you know, I just got out of an abusive relationship. We don't give accommodations for that at the Office of Accessibility. So, but that doesn't change the fact that the student is being limited in their abilities to succeed in our classes, often because we're not thinking about how that might affect them. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I put this out there right at the beginning. I mean, there's not going to be any student in any semester who makes it through without a bout of anxiety. I mean, they take tests. So I feel like they may not be comfortable enough to talk about diagnoses or events that are happening that are causing them distress, but they will have language for anxiety and depression when they come into your classroom. I forget names when I'm returning papers. It happens to me every time. I can't remember my students' names as soon as I'm returning papers. It's one of my social anxieties, and it just happens. I blank. And so I just tell them that, you know, and I feel like if it's more of a dialogue in the classroom and we just go with the understanding that all of our students have some trauma or some pain or some event or condition that's going to impact them in this way, then we can have a shift in our own mind about what it means to teach the whole person when we use that language, and just to be open to that and flexible and adapt to situations as they may arise. And that takes a lot of observing all the time, which if you have a ton of students in your classroom, I would say is infinitely more difficult than what I have with my 15 to 20 students in a class. But that's been my approach, and it just seems to kind of help. So I don't know if that helps anybody out there, but just to like have a language for it, you know, and it's depersonalized in that way, just to kind of have a blurb about anxiety or whatever in the syllabus, I think can help them feel more comfortable coming and talking to you. The same as, you know, a student in the LGBTQ community may feel more comfortable coming and talking to you because you address that, you know, in your syllabus. So for me, it's a policy like any other.
And I'll kind of, this is Rebecca Elkins, by the way. I have had things in my syllabus before, and I'll be honest with you, most of the time students are not always comfortable still even coming forward. And kind of, I want to also add that, like, I know students will have anxiety at different times, but some of them it may not impact, right? Like, so I think it's important, you were talking about, Jen and Rachel, observing students and seeing. So I had put in the chat a question about helping, because sometimes I do see my students struggling, like, and they won't come. A lot of students don't feel it's appropriate, or they have the ability to come to you if they're struggling, if they don't have an accommodation, or maybe they just don't feel like it's a good excuse or something. But I have reached out to students, and a lot of them, some of them may never get back to me because they're having issues they just don't want to disclose. So they continue to struggle. But if I see them not turning in assignments or having poor quality assignments, or like, I usually will reach out to them and contact the students and say, hey, just checking in, making sure everything's okay. If you need, you know, if we need to set up some type of plan for whatever's happening, that's fine. But like, I try to let them know that I'm available for them to talk to, because I think especially the last 2 semesters where we're online, right? Students, I feel like you don't see them face to face, so they don't know your personality as much. And I think that's part of why I wanted to come on here and look at the discussion board thing the other day. Like, how do we get students to know us and not be, I don't want to say afraid, hopefully no one's afraid, but like to be willing to disclose their struggles and not feel like, hey, like Ryan A was saying earlier, there are some who may be more strict and not as lenient. When I was at UC, I had a student whose sister went into labor early and almost lost her life and the baby. And so they didn't finish an assignment. I'm like, yeah, you're fine. Like, life happens. I understand. I'm going to accommodate. But there was another teacher who was like, no way, the deadline was this day. So, so being able to, I don't know if I don't know. I guess my question was, what do we do if we see students struggling? We know, I mean, I don't think every student needs an accommodation. I don't know, I might be wrong. Maybe they do have anxiety, depression, but if it's not impacting them, then I don't feel like I should say, hey, you know, what can I do? But for students we do see are struggling that may or may not have any accommodation plan. Maybe they're just having, in that instant, a life situation. Like, how can we help them if we see them? I guess, I mean, maybe there's nothing we can do beyond reaching out and seeing.
That's what I was, so 2 things. And I meant to say this earlier.
Real quick, we're gonna have to wrap this up very soon.
Yep, this is super fast. So we all just got a folder from the student affairs group that has information about if this, then this, and like what office is worth what. So you should have one in your mailbox, but if you don't, I was just amazed at how helpful it was. So that's a good resource if you see a student struggling. But I think sometimes just saying like, hey, I noticed you missed class, or I noticed this assignment's late. Is there anything I can do to assist you? The student then knows that you're there and available, but can choose to connect with you or not. So I think you're doing exactly the right thing. We can't force them to do things. So anyway, that's it. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. For the rest of you who had questions about Canvas and dates and such, please feel free to reach out to any of the instructional designers. We would be happy to help you with that. Any other questions for Jen? You can definitely pop into the discussion board chat and we will get to them when we can, or reach out to her directly. I'm sure she wouldn't mind. But thank you guys very, very much. And we're going to get ready to hop into the next 11 o'clock session.